All right, welcome everyone to our VistaVu's Q&A Cafe for ByDesign report writing tips and tricks. My name is Kayla. I'll be the facilitator for this session today. Alex Waddell is going to be your presenter. I just have a few things to chat about before we get started, so bear with me. I see that this reporting for ByDesign is very popular topic, so we'll be carrying it on into May and maybe June. If you have any questions throughout, just put them in the questions in the chat boxes, and myself and my other facilitator, Lana, will do our best in writing those down for future sessions or relaying them to Alex once he's done with his presentation. What else? We will be recording this session, so if you're not okay with that, then I would suggest getting off right now. And then also, once that recording is done for today, I'll be sending that out to everyone tomorrow. To register for future Q&As, we have those on our resources page on our website. Our next topic is how do general ledger determinations work in ByDesign? So with that, I will send it over to Alex and he'll continue on for the session.
Great, thank you, Kayla. So welcome everyone. My name is Alex Waddell. So I've been with VistaVu for about 13 years. My background is in finance accounting. This is the first Q&A Cafe webinar that I've run personally, so bear with me if it's a little bumpy till I get my groove, but thank you all for coming. I look forward to showing you today the reporting fundamentals. So this is going to be a fairly basic overview of how reports work. If you already have a basic understanding of reports, you may still want to continue on because a lot of times you stumble into a few tips and tricks that you may not have seen before. And then, like Kayla said, if there's any questions that kind of go a little bit deeper than we're able to get into this call, we'll take those questions away and we'll try and address them in future more advanced training. So with that, in SAP ByDesign, when it comes to reporting, your reports exist in two different places, actually 3 different places, depending on the permissions you have in the system. So if you go into your home work center and you click on the report list, depending on how your permissions have been set up in the system, and as I'm logged in as a high-level administrator, I have access to all the reports. So if I start scrolling down on the right, I can see there's 674 reports available to me. In addition to that, I could go into a specific work center. So for example, if I go into, let's say, the supplier work center and look at the report list in here, I get a much shorter list of reports. So there's only 12 reports in this work center. So reports inside a work center are specific to that work center, and they may also be duplicated among other work centers. So it is possible that you may see the same report exist in both supplier invoicing and supplier base, but they may not have all the same identical reports. So keeping that in mind, it doesn't matter which way you go to find a specific report in the system. Just know that if you perhaps don't know the work center that it belongs to, but you do recall the title, you're probably best served to go into the home work center, and then you can search through all the reports. If you recall what the report relates to, like the specific work area, but you can't really remember what it's called, then you could start with the work center and go that way. Either way should get you to the report you're looking for. So when we talk about SAP ByDesign 600 reports in the system, those are sets of data that have been pre-created by various table joins. We'll talk about how we could also enhance those table joins or create additional joins in future more in-depth training. But we find that most of our clients will get 90% of their reporting needs with the massive amounts of join data that already exist, which are then amalgamated into those over 600 available reports, which as you'll see in a moment when we go in to look for a specific report, you have so many variations of combining data from a single report that even a single report has almost limitless combinations and ways that it can be displayed. So for today's training, I'm going to focus on a report that is very useful, especially for accountants. When I go into a report list like the general ledger, I've already gone through here and I've made some of my reports priority reports. So that's a handy little trick. If you click on a row of a report that you do use quite often, highlight that row by clicking on the box to the left, click on the priority button and mark it as a priority. That way, when you come in, you could quickly filter to your reports, your priority reports, or set that as your default view. And then you just filter down the reports that you use often. So I'm going to go into the GL account line items. I would say that many people that are doing any kind of account reconciliation in the system, GL account reconciliation or cost analysis, this is a report where they come to all the time because it has a lot of data in it, a lot of joined tables. So you can get a lot of information from your GL as well as the associated subledgers. So this is a very handy report. Now, when you open any report in ByDesign, you get a very similar looking panel with just the name of the report at the top. And then you have two components to build your report. Component one is called the selection, and component two is called the view. So the difference between these two elements is your selection is really the criteria for the data that's going to be displayed in your report. So that would be the when, like the date periods that you're running, the what as far as which specific GL accounts or which specific companies or which sets of books, whatever data fields you want to filter on, whereas the view is going to be the how you display that report. So let's start with selecting some basic criteria. You can have pre-saved selections, but I'm going to just quickly build one from scratch. So I'm going to start with this, what's called an initial selection. And you can see up here, there is a drop-down associated with that. So if I go in here and I start making changes to this, I have the ability to start putting in my filtering data based on two different value options. One is called relatives and one is called absolute. So relative value means the choice in here is going to be dynamic, meaning that if I choose a dynamic value, each month or each period that I come in to run that report, or if the data in the system changes, it will dynamically update the parameters so that I don't have to constantly go in and update my selections. So this is very useful, for example, when you're dealing with periods. If you're running a report that you always want to refer to the current period or the last period, you won't have to constantly go in and update the absolute value. For my company, I am going to choose an absolute value because I'm an administrator, so I don't have access to a default company. I'm going to quickly set a set of books, and you can see in here, sometimes you don't have absolute and relative if it's a very simple parameter. And for my purposes, this is a good example with dates where the relative values are very useful. I'm going to choose last fiscal year because likely my test data is more robust there. And then I'm going to select some GL accounts. So when you get into selections that are fairly lengthy like this, the search field can be very useful to you. If I were to scroll down, you can see it gives me all of my GL accounts. So an easy way to filter would be to put in, let's say, a 1 star to get all of my asset accounts. And if I wanted to run this full bank of counts, rather than setting them individually, I can just select on the header, and that'll select all of them into my report. So right there, we've got enough basic data to probably just launch this report and see what it looks like. If I click on the apply button, I'm going to get some data showing up in my report. Now, how did it determine the columns in the report? That's based on this view tab. So we're going to move off the selection bubble onto the view bubble. And we can see that these are the columns that came as the default view with my report. So where the selection was filtering the criteria, these are the GL accounts I'm getting. The view is saying that this is the how we want the report displayed. So across our rows, we want our GL account, our posting date, our journal entries. And then our columns contain our key figures, which is really the value amounts that we're returning in the report. And those will always be in white, whereas the additional data parameters will be in gray. If you've got data that goes beyond what your screen will contain, which is a few hundred rows, you will see at the bottom here that you could have multiple pages. So this is a good example of just getting some basic data in our report. Where this gets really powerful now is the ability to add fields and make this report a lot more robust. So if I click the plus sign beside the row field, I have access to hundreds of additional data sets. And within a lot of those data sets, There's expansion fields. So for example, if I were to expand on one of those data sets, I could choose my GL account, but I could also create or add data relating to that particular data set as well. So what is the GL account type, or what chart of accounts does it belong to? If I were to choose an employee, I have a lot of information about that employee that I could add to this report. So uh, every report will have a different available number of fields based on how those data joins have been created. But as mentioned, this GL accounts report is very robust. So if there's something that we want to search for, you can type it in here, or you can scroll down and find it. So let's say I add business partner to this report. And in this particular case, we can see that business partner is a field that is not always available. So in some cases, when you're doing a journal entry, it may not relate to a business partner. But if we were to scroll down far enough to, let's say, our customer invoicing GL account, then business partners do come into play. So let's talk a little bit about what you do when you get a data set and how you can manipulate it. So these white rows are showing us particular subtotaling that's happening in this particular report. And right now this report is quite large and it's got some confusing subtotals. So let's clean that up a little bit. Maybe one thing we'll do is go back to our selection and let's limit the number of GL accounts. But before we do that, let's save our selection so that we don't lose the work that we've created here. So when we talk about saving our selections and views, there's going to be a floppy disk kind of icon beside the selection parameter and one beside the view. So selections and views are saved independently and they can be mixed and matched to create even more reporting combinations later on. So I'm going to make sure I'm focused on the selection. I'm going to choose to save. And when I save this, I want to give it a meaningful name that doesn't relate to the view, but relates to the selection. So what is this view really about? It's about company 1000 all asset accounts. And we could even say last year. So once I've saved that, it's given it a name at the top here, and that'll be available to this personal user who's created this report. A little bit later, I'll talk about how you can create selections as an administrator that you could allow the entire organization to access. But the way that I've run this particular report, this will be saved as my own personal view and can only be accessed by me. So as soon as I go in and change some of this data, so let's remove some of these accounts. And let's just focus on that 11,000 accounts receivable account. So I'm going to clear this out. I could just type this in to save myself a pop-up, click the apply button. So now I've limited this report, so it's a little bit more manageable for us. And because we've made a modification to it, the system understands that. So it says this selection has been modified. Now when I click on the save, I have the ability to overwrite this current selection. I don't really want to use this same name because it's not meaningful anymore. So I'm going to choose save as. And instead of all asset accounts, I'm just going to say AR account. So let's go back to our view and now manipulate this report a little bit more to make it a bit more legible. So these subtotals at the change in business partner is not really meaningful where it is. So we could either eliminate this subtotal, or perhaps you want to take the business partner and move it up. So if we were to make the business partner the first field, now having a subtotal underneath each one is a bit more meaningful. However, if you didn't want to see that data that way, you could remove the subtotal by clicking on the ellipses beside that particular dimension field, go to your characteristic settings, and under the result row, indicate that you do not want to show it. And so that removes one of those elements, and there's also a subtotal now on the GL account. So let's move the GL account up to the top again, and we get a report that looks something like that. So you've got a lot of flexibility there to manipulate and see how your data wants to display. So let's start adding additional parameter fields. So if we go in and add something like our company, we now get our legal entity. So Once again, we've got the same situation where we've got company as a subtotal. So I could take this and I could move it to the top. So that's a bit more meaningful. But as a user, what might be interesting to me is even though I've added company to this report, I'm only seeing one company. So why is that? Because you have to remember that your selection, your filter criteria is what's limiting the specific data set that's being pulled into this report. So if I wanted to modify this, I would need to go back to my selections and potentially add an additional company. And then I could test that report again and see. And so now you can see that I actually have receivables in two different legal entities. And I've got a lot of flexibility to add additional fields and pivot that data. So another interesting way to pivot the data is to pull it into the column field. So if I were to take my company and pull it down into my columns, now I'm getting a view that's like this. So that's another useful way to see data. If we put this back the way it was and add a different field, like let's say period, period comparative could be quite useful. So one thing we haven't done is we haven't been saving our views as we go along, but at any point you could click on the disk here and you could decide to save that. So once again, enter a description that's meaningful to the view. So this could be GL by line with company and period compare. And then keeping in mind that at any point in time, you can mix and match those views. So we can go back to that previously created all asset account view and invoke it, that selection with this existing view. And now we get a much different report. So the power in your report to create those and mix and match are very useful. Let's talk a little bit about exporting reports. So if you have a report and you have some data and you want to bring it into Excel, you would click on this item with the arrow and download. And there's two different ways to do exports. You can do a raw CSV format. I'll show you both of these. So if we do a CSV export, you get the data in raw Excel. And where this can tend to be problematic is in your amount fields because of your currency indicator. So then you end up having to do quite a bit of manipulation in Excel to potentially get this to be an actual number instead of text the way it's coming in. I also don't really like that I've got all these blanks here. So if I want to take this information and pivot it, that causes me some problems. So let's see if I can fix both of those situations. So I'm going to abandon this Excel. And I'm going to go back to our report and I'm going to go into the settings. And just to illustrate it, because what I want to do is I want to get rid of all this blank space where things are being indented. So I'm going to go into my settings and I'm going to indicate that I want display repeated text to be turned on. Then I'm going to apply. And that fills everything down nicely so that this report is much more suited to exporting. So if we do an export now, in addition to that, I'm going to do it this time as an XML format. And now I have a report where I don't have data gaps in my data. And in addition to that, because it's brought into XML, the system is actually reading this as a true number. So for example, if I highlight this, I get my sum feature in Excel. What you may find is that this header information may or may not be useful to you. So you could always delete this if that's causing you problems from filtering and things like that being turned on. Other useful options here is the start options. So regarding your selections, you can choose one of your saved selections to automatically start, Or you may want to hide the selection area, which just means closing up this panel similar to this. So if you want a little bit more real estate on your page, you've got that ability to collapse this panel and open up your default either into your selections or views. And along the same lines, to do maintenance on your selections and views, you have the ability to go into the manage. And you can see all of the personal ones that have been created. You can at any point come by and delete anything, or you could make one a default so it runs automatically every time you launch this report. Now you don't have a way to combine a selection and a view to automatically run together unless you set them both as the default. However, you can accomplish that by creating combinations of selections and views in your dashboards or in report broadcasts, which is a subject we'll get into during later training sessions. So I'm going to leave our settings and let's go back and look at a little bit more sophistication that we can do in the area for key figures. So to make this a bit easier for you to see, I'm going to remove the accounting period field. And we're going to look at our data that we have in this report. And let's see if we wanted to do a bit more analysis on this. We can go into our key figures. So the key figures, as I mentioned, are the amounts or calculations that are being done on your reports. You also have the ability to create custom key figures, which is something else we will train on in a future session. So if you go into the key figure settings, you'll see all the available key figures. So for example, if you prefer to work in the balance field, you could add that to your report. You could do that instead of your debits and credits. That's up to you. Or you could have them both displayed. It just gives you another way to show your reports. So balance would show negatives on some of the rows if it potentially was meaningful. And then in addition to that, I can do things like filtering and conditional formatting. So we'll focus on the conditional formatting with the time I have left here. We're going to create a quick conditional format. So we'll want to give it a name. So let's call it something like over 1K. So we want to illustrate numbers based on some sort of a parameter. So we're going to look at the balance of the company. We're going to analyze the data and the result, and we'll just give it a traffic light indicator. So here's where we build our criteria for our analysis. So you've got all the standard threshold analysis indicators. And then you indicate what is it that you want to flag. So maybe we want to flag those as green. We'll choose OK, and we'll make this active. And then you'll see you'll get a green box beside any of the rows that meet that particular parameter. So under those conditional formatting, you can have multiple conditional formatting rules, or you can have multiple thresholds working at the same time. So for example, I could also create one that is maybe less than or equal to 1,000 and potentially highlight those in red. So this could be very useful in a collections report, in a customer balance report, things like that, aging reports to illustrate based on certain criteria. Also, you can look at this from a trend perspective. So if we want to do conditional formatting based on a trend, you can choose the arrow indicator. And then you can choose how do you want the trend to be showing. So you could set one to be an upward trend and one to be a decreasing trend. And this could be very useful, for example, in like a budget analysis income statement report to try and draw attention to where you're significantly over budget or over budget based on a certain fixed amount, which is what I've done here. In addition to that, you have the ability to also do value filters where you could filter out specific data. So we could do filter on our particular balance based on a characteristic. So if we were to do a ranked condition, then what a ranked condition could be showing you is a bottom or top percentile, which might be a little bit more meaningful than doing a fixed figure. So for example, if I were to do anything within the top 10%, then it would filter out the data based on that criteria. So that gives you an idea of what the selections and views done. We've talked a little bit about the settings. One of the other areas in the settings I'd like to show you is the hierarchy. There aren't a lot of hierarchical information inside the GL report. So for this one, I'm going to just switch over. We're going to go to a financial report. So let's look at a financial statement. If you run income statements, I've already got some income statements pre-built here. So let me just open up a consolidated, non-eliminated income statement. And I'm going to go to my view, and I'm going to expand this report. So I'm going to go to my characteristic settings. And income statements, financial reports are built on a hierarchical report set, which is how the data is triggered. So this behaves a little bit different as far as how the columns work. So instead, we have all of our data in an expanding column. So if I want to expand that to fully expanded, I get down to the functional areas, which many of our clients, that's a common way that they're running their income statements. And at this point, this is meaningful, but what we don't have is our GL account. So as soon as I add the GL account to this report, where this becomes problematic is by associating it as a separate column. The system is now adding that GL account, repeating it on every single subtotal row. So here where we see our difference from purchasing, our 25,000, we also see that same 25,000. So this report is quite unlegible the way it is. So instead, we're going to go to our settings, we're going to go to our hierarchy, and we want to arrange the report fully to be arranged in a standard hierarchy. So if I do that and I click apply, I can now drill down and I can see the GL accounts in that consolidated column. And so it's not repeating in every single subtotal. So this is very useful. I could also fully expand that. This is very useful whenever you're running a report that's built on a report set. So that would be an income statement, a balance sheet, something like that. So I think with our last few minutes, maybe what I'll do is just pause here and I'll see if anybody has any questions about what I have shown so far. So Kayla, I'm not seeing the question panel. So do you have any questions that you have captured?
We do, yes. So the first one kind of came early. It says, is this only for finance people? I would imagine this is directed towards the finance departments at businesses, but we can probably look at other reporting in other topics coming up.
Well, it doesn't really matter what report you're running. All the concept that I've shown you run in any sort of reporting environment. So, I mean, you can run a manufacturing report, you could run a supply chain or a marketing report, and all of the data sets work on the same principles. So anytime I go into any sort of report in the system, I am going to land in this sort of a report builder view with my selections or view. What's going to be different are the criteria fields and the fields that I can show. But all the training that I've shown you here applies to any report you run in ByDesign.
Okay, great. The next one, is there a way to promote a personal save to corporate?
So unfortunately, you can't take something that you've already done the work on and now save it as a corporate one. You have to redo it. So depending on whether or not you have access to business analytics, and depending if you're an administrator in the system, there's likely somebody in your organization that has access to this particular work center. So if I go to business analytics and design reports, I will see all of the same reports that I see in my homework center, although the view looks a little bit different here. I can still search for any of those same reports. So let me find that GL account report that we were just looking at. I can open it and I get into this same report builder view screen. Now the difference here is as soon as I start changing my parameters, you can see across the top, it says report opened in administration. So at this point, if I choose the save option, I have now saved it as a corporate report. And were I to run this report as a user through one of the work centers, I would see this particular selection, pardon me, underneath a category called corporate. So just to reiterate, if you've already built it, you unfortunately have to do it again in this work center. You can't transfer it over. So keep that in mind if you are going to start building some reports and you think would be useful to other users. You want to make sure that you do it in that business administration work center or business analytics work center.
Okay, and the last one I see here is, how do you remove or add the result subtotals?
Yeah, so in that, let's pop back into that GL account report line items. So I have, I'm going to leave my settings here. So I still have a couple of results. This can actually be a little bit misleading. So it looks to me like I've got a result here at the company and a result here at the GL account. I have to do each of those individually. So if I go to the GL account and I click on those ellipses, go to the characteristic settings, and they say do not show, then it gets rid of that one. And it looks like I still have one at the company. So once again, I can go in here and choose, sorry, characteristic settings, say do not show. So if you're trying to get just a flat data grid like this for export to Excel, that works well. You may run into a situation where you're still seeing a subtotal and it doesn't seem like it's quite lining up to the column. If that happens, check the field to the left. So for example, if you're getting a business partner subtotal, but you've already verified that, move over to the GL account and check that one, or go through each of these one at a time and just make sure on your characteristic settings it's set to do not show, and you will be able to get rid of all of the subtotals. Also keep in mind that your totals can exist in your columns as well. So if I were to move a particular data field over here, you could also have a total on the left as well. So I can go to my characteristic settings and I can say show. I think in this case, I only have my one company, so that's not that interesting, but I'm also getting a subtotal here in my column. So keep that in mind. You have the ability to access totals in both columns and rows. What else, Kayla?
Yeah, so there's no other questions in the questions box or the chat box. So if anybody else would like to ask a question, we have time right now. Otherwise, we will go back to our working from home situations.
Sure. So
um,
why don't just give a few seconds if anybody else has a question, and I just thank everybody for attending this session. Uh, you're welcome to reach out to us if you want to maybe give suggestions or ideas for future content. So what, like I mentioned before, some of the areas we will be covering in the future will be more advanced features on reports, like how to build your own data sets, how to create your own key figures, how to do broadcast bursts to send the output of your reports automatically to users without them having to go into the system and get the report themselves. So that's some of the ideas that we have in mind. If there's other areas that you're interested in, please forward them to us, and we'd be happy to look into building out future Q&A cafe topic matter.
mhm. Yeah, and the next one I'll just reiterate, it's how do general ledger determinations work in Business by Design? So that's our next one. That's on April 15th.
That's right, and I think I'm the
Mhm.
lucky presenter for that as well. So you will
You
hear my
are.
voice again for half an hour.
Yep. Oh, hold on. Will you be posting this recording to your website? Not to our website. I'll be emailing it out to anyone and then who is registered or attended this session. And you're welcome to forward that to anyone at your company or on your team. Are there any tricks to finding a particular data field to add report?
Um, Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to know when you're in here and you have a lot. So oftentimes if you start searching on something, like if I search the word company, you'll see that I get it many times because there is different variations, company postal code, company ID. So what I do sometimes find useful, if I'm really just truly looking for the company, is I want to scroll down and find the one where it's at the first indent in the report. So it's the furthest over to the left, because all of these are um, already indented, then I know that's the wrong one. Now, unfortunately, if you don't know the name of the field, then you sometimes have to try doing different searches. I'd also like to mention that if you can't find a particular field here, it is possible that the data set has additional fields that are hidden. And if you go into the settings and choose the add fields here, you get a list based on the data sets. So this is another good way to go and look for specific informational data. So for example, if I go into the accounting and I expand it from here, I can start to expand and I can see that potentially GL accounts also has the ability to show, for example, chart of accounts, but it's not automatically ready to display in the report. So I can choose to add that to my report as well from this more fulsome view than what you're getting on the plus sign here. And at the same time, you can also take any of the existing fields and force them to be available into your selection. So if I do that, and I choose OK here, I'm going to give this just a second to update because it's going to update both the selection and the views. So you can see that now we get our chart of accounts field showing here. And if we go to our selection, it will become an available field down here as well to add as your criteria. So once you do that and you save this view and selection, this will be available anytime you want to run that report in the future. So you do have the ability to modify the available fields in your criteria selection. So thank you for that question, because I'm glad I had a chance to show you that.
Yeah, and just the last two questions are for future training, and I'll take that offline and get back to that individual and with Alex for future topics. But other than that, I don't see anything else, Alex.
Okay, that's great. Well, then thank you everybody for attending. Please stay safe and healthy, and we'll talk to you soon. I hope to see you at the next Q&A Cafe.
Great. Thank you, everyone.